Well, let's get some analysis into this. We have Jason Unruhe, who's a political commentator, who joins us. And stay with us, Mohammed Ali, by the way. Jason Unruhe, so we're looking at this operation that is taking place right now. What are your initial thoughts here? Of course, the lives of many are at stake. And I'd like to also then follow through with asking you about the U.S. role. But initially, what reactions do you have to this?
Well, I think that this situation is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better, but I think that's kind of obvious at this point. Well, there's always been a great regional tension between Syria, Turkey, and the Kurds inside of Syria, and for the most part, much of the hostility was actually kept under wraps. It was mostly kept to a very minimal level, but an explosion like this has been a long time coming. You can't leave contradictions like this alone for long until they eventually blow, and then you have a situation like this where all the sides are going to confront each other. It's interesting that all of this happened largely due to the creation of ISIS by primarily Israel, the U.S., and Saudi Arabia as an attempt to subvert any countries in the region that do not support their particular interests in their alliance with U.S. imperialism. And then this happens, this creating and making everything so much worse than things are. I mean, the Middle East is a region that has been known to have many problems for many times, largely due to the meddling of imperialist powers. But here you see essentially the three main powers that are behind this simply standing back and watching everything unfold. I mean, it's a hard situation to really grasp. When the U.S. military pulls out of anywhere, that's always a good thing. Well, the United States has never been beneficial to anyone coming in and militarily occupying their position. So on the one hand, it's great to see the United States leave to some degree. I'm sure they haven't pulled out all their forces from Syria, but it's great to see them pull out to some degree to leave Syria to its own fate and to decide its own future. However, of course, this situation is much more complex than that. The Kurdish forces in the region have been carrying out attacks against Turkey for a number of decades now, and with this opportunity, a lack of Syrian government authority in those regions and a lack of U.S. power to cover the Kurds, Turkey is obviously going to take advantage of this situation to come in and try to deal with many of the base of power for the attacks that are launched against them. And of course, it is in their interest, it is in their interest to do so. So what we have is a great mess that has been caused by imperialist meddling. Much of this situation was completely unnecessary. None of this had to happen. All of this could have been avoided had the United States not decided to try to destabilize the Syrian government to mind their own business, etc. But that's not the nature of imperialism. Imperialism exists as an economic phenomenon, a stage of monopoly capital that must expand beyond its borders and by force if necessary. And with the case of many Middle Eastern countries, that has always been the case, where force is necessary. It has always been necessary to use force to do so. So it is, in a very real sense, a major upheaval in this area, and it's a messy situation where a lot of power players are looking to grab up influence, are looking to defend their own interests. Some of them simply trying to create regional stability, as you see with the alliance between Iran, Syria, and to a degree Iraq as well. Many people who just want to get back to a normal life and to just be able to function without interference by the imperialist powers and the Daesh, the Wahhabists, the Takfiri, whichever term you prefer to use, removing them from the region, so that a much more common sense kind of mentality and social society can exist in order for the world to just simply function as peacefully as possible. And I think that it's very unfortunate that things had to be this way. If I were in power, I would simply offer the Kurds a semi-autonomous region. If I were running Syria, I would just offer the Kurds a semi-autonomous region in a kind of federalized state, and say, well, here's your own land. We can have peace. Turkey can return to its borders for the most part. Any aggressions by the Kurds against Turkey would no longer be necessary. But it's easy for me to sit here and say that and not be a part of the actual materially existing situation on the ground, and that makes things much more complicated than any theory that you can propose to try to solve the situation. But in the end, my main point is that this is a terribly complicated situation that's going to get worse before it gets better.
Jason and Ruhe, we're looking at this operation to have taken place after the U.S. Pulled out of that area, although, as you mentioned, it's still not clear whether they are going to be pulling out all of their forces. That remains to be seen. But the U.S. role over here is somewhat dubious. If we want to take a look at how this operation actually began, do you think there was behind-the-scenes agreement in terms of how Turkey and the U.S. are playing this out? And also, what are we looking at in terms of this operation and the scope and the scale? If Turkey is able to go into northeastern Syria and take over that area that it says it wants to cleanse the terrorists out of that area, and of course these Kurdish forces, then what is going to keep them from moving more into Syrian territory? Because in the theater of war, there is no rhyme or reason behind what, in this case, Turkey might do.
Well, it is pretty complicated, and I think that for the most part there was a relative agreement between the United States and Turkey. I mean, everybody knows that the Kurds were working on behalf of the United States. I mean, they've been doing so for years, and the United States, no doubt, was telling Turkey, this is how things are going to proceed. The Kurds are going to occupy a certain territory for us. This is how things are going to be, and if you do anything against it, then we will unfortunately have to turn our attention towards you. And this is how it was relatively stable up until the presidency of Donald Trump, in which much foreign policy is made in knee-jerk reactions and vague, ill-defined decisions, sometimes even just tweets. I think that it's very clear that Trump himself has had no clear foreign policy on this situation, and much of it he probably didn't like the existing, merely because it was created, or at least under the watch of his predecessor Barack Obama, which he has a very notorious feud with. So I think that plays a lot into that. Much of the chaos that we see is because Trump has not had a solid policy in this regard. Of course, he's facing an election soon, and a lot of enemies are swarming around him. He's failing in terms of trying to build a border wall. It appears his taxes are going to be released. He's facing a major investigation for alleged corruption in trying to get Ukraine to go after one of his political opponents. And one of the major things that his presidency said was one of the things that he promised he would do during the campaign would be to cut back on the wars and to not be involved in so many places overseas, which has not been the case. I mean, imperialism has continued to function as relatively normal as possible. It's been rather chaotic under his leadership, but it has maintained its position in the world. Now, I think that he's pulled out just so that he can turn to his supporters and say, "Oh, I said I would cut back the wars, and this is what I've done." And this has thrown a major wrench into the operations, much of the planning that the United States has gone through over the course of this entire war in trying to forward their interests inside the region. And then here you have Trump, for his own selfish reasons, simply trashing all of that basically overnight on a whim in order to serve himself, and that's going to throw all kinds of things into chaos. Basically, everything the U.S. had told Turkey that they were going to do, everything that they had told the Turks. Pardon me, the Kurds that they were going to do has now just been simply kiboshed, and the Kurds are now in a very unenviable situation of having created a lot of enemies around themselves, and then now being forced to be rather humble, not having the United States as a force to try to guarantee themselves. Since the Kurdish operations began, there's been many reports of them ethnically cleansing many Syrian towns by simply evicting ethnic Arabs from their homes, not killing them, but forcing them out of their homes and forcing them to leave the city, and then bringing in Kurds to reoccupy those places. So they've engendered a great deal of anger towards them by the Arab population of Syria that I don't doubt much of these Syrians are going to want revenge for that. And hopefully cooler heads will prevail and a much more peaceful solution can be created. But now all of a sudden the Kurds find themselves without the support of the United States, and that's a really bad thing for them when you consider how surrounded by enemies they are right now. I mean, the Kurds essentially occupied oil fields in I believe, the northeastern part of the country in order to hold those oil fields for the U.S., and there was talk of production beginning and selling that oil. And it was reported by several, not mainstream, the mainstream tended to look the other way on this, but it was reported that an Israeli Mossad agent was the only person authorized to sell the oil that was to come out of the Kurdish region. And this, while the mainstream media did not report it, much of the countries in the region certainly did hear about this. And that's any ally with Israel is not a way to endear yourself to much of the population of the Middle East and would gain those kinds of hostilities. I think that what we've seen is that the Kurds have been very opportunistic. We recall several decades ago when the United States was talking with the Kurds inside of Iraq. They had promised them, if you rise up against Saddam Hussein, we will back you up and we will send forces to help you, etc. And what happened was the Kurds inside the country rose up against Saddam Hussein. The U.S. was nowhere to be found. And then what you had afterwards, unfortunately, was the gassing of those Kurds by the Hussein government. So there's already a history between the Kurds and the United States, showing them very well that they cannot trust the United States, but yet they continued to do so anyway. And to a degree, you could probably understand the Kurds are in a very untenable position and are very opportunistically looking for anything that could give them a piece of legitimacy or to allow them to practice a kind of autonomy. And these talks between the Syrian government and the Kurds are probably the best thing that could be happening right now. I'm sure some kind of mutually beneficial agreement can be reached. Any hostilities between ethnic Arabs and Kurds in Syria can be put back to a relatively stable place. And hopefully one day Syria can be a whole country again. But clearly this is going to require the effort of the Syrian government to fight back against the Turkish forces. Turkey's been looking to get rid of the Kurds for a very long time now, and they see an opportunity to do so. The Syrian government their forces have not necessarily reached areas far enough to confront them, which they would have to accelerate in order to do. The Kurds no longer enjoy the protection of the United States. And because of all this chaos, because of all this upheaval, this is the prime opportunity that Turkey has been looking for to deal with what they consider to be the Kurdish problem inside the region. And unfortunately, this is going to be very, very bloody.